Hello again, and welcome to our continued study of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. The first page here has information about contacting us. If you would like to look at other lessons that are available, if you perhaps missed one of the lessons from this particular series, they'll be there. Or if you just want to ask questions, learn more about us, we'd be glad for you to contact us, and the information to do so is on this page. We welcome you tonight to a study of 2nd Samuel. And we'll be considering chapters 14, 15, and 16. As we see from the outline that's been sort of guiding us throughout this study, we're in the time when it might be called the troubles in David's kingdom. He's already had a number of troubles with his family, and the troubles in his kingdom are, of course, going to involve his family, but they directly involve his kingship and his ability to keep the throne and to rule as God had intended for him to rule. So we'll be looking at those chapters now as we come toward the end of the book of 2 Samuel. The first thing that we see happening as we introduce chapter 14 is that David's son Absalom is returning to Jerusalem after an absence of having run away, fled for his life. So Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom. And Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman and said to her, "Please pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning apparel. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but act like a woman who has been mourning a long time for the dead." Now, just to review, we know that Absalom fled for his life because he had murdered his brother, actually his half-brother, Amnon, because Amnon had molested Absalom's full sister named Tamar. And he waited for some time to get revenge for that, but then he did eventually have the opportunity, and he took the opportunity to kill his brother Amnon. And knowing that his father would be upset about that, of course, and perhaps would seek his life, he fled to a distant place for a period of time. But now it's come time that David, although he's still angry about this, certainly did not approve of what Absalom did, he is thinking about this son, and he's wanting to perhaps have him come back to Jerusalem, but he's not quite ready to make that decision. He's going to need a little prompting, and that's going to happen by way of Joab, who was the commander of his army. Joab comes up with this plot that's going to involve this wise woman from Tekoa. Now, the word wise there can have a number of connotations, but in this case, it means, among other things, subtle, crafty, or cunning, because she is going to pretend to be someone that she is not. She's going to tell a story that is not her own in an attempt to make David think about Absalom and hopefully make the decision to allow him to come back. But all that she does is going to be because of what Joab tells her. So go to the king, this is what Joab tells the woman, and speak to him in this manner. So Joab put the words in her mouth. So she was basically a paid participant, an actor working for hire to pretend to be someone in front of David, and Joab thought might encourage David to allow Absalom to come back. So Joab writes the script for her completely. He gives her this parable. It's a parable that she says to King David is the truth about her, when in reality it's not. It seems that she pretends to be a widow who had two sons, and the sons got into a fight in the field one day, and one of them killed the other. Now, the rest of the family who is associated with this woman wants justice. They apparently think that the other son should be killed because he shed innocent blood, and something should be done about that. They want justice. But the woman, of course, does not want to lose both sons. She's already lost one son, as the story goes. And so she wants King David to intervene and to command that nothing is going to happen to this other son, that he can come back from wherever he is and everyone will leave him alone. In fact, she asked the king to do something about the avenger of blood. Now, in the Old Testament times, under the Old Covenant, the avenger of blood was the nearest male relative. And when something happened to someone in the family, it was the responsibility, the duty of the avenger of blood to see that justice was done, even to the point of carrying out justice himself in the case where that was necessary. So as the story is told by this woman from Tekoa to King David, she says, but the avenger of blood will seek his life. And he asked the king, please stop this. So David hears this story, and he's very sensitive to her. He realizes she doesn't want to lose this other son. She is already hurting enough because of that. And so King David said, I'm going to make a command. Nobody is going to hurt your son. As far as the avenger of blood, he's not going to be allowed to hurt your son either. In other words, your son can come back and you can have one son since you've lost the other one, and no one will hurt him. And so King David assures her the safety of this king, of this son. Now, when you listen to this and you read that she's telling it to King David, it's a little bit reminiscent of the story, a parable of a sort, that Nathan brought to David when he told David about the man who had one little lamb and the other fellow who had all the sheep, and he took the lamb in order to kill it and prepare it for a guest. And Nathan is pointing out to David his guilt in this situation. It applies to him. So in this place, that woman who's talking to David is showing him that this is his situation, not necessarily that he's guilty of something in this case, but he's doing something that even by answering her request, he said it's really not right. There needs to be a protection for this other son. And so she continues as she talks to King David, and apparently in a very effective way. The woman says, why then have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? For the king speaks this thing as one who is guilty, and that the king does not bring his banished one, home again. And so we would almost think, why isn't David recognizing this even before this line comes out? Why didn't he understand that this is a very similar situation? There's no indication that he did. But at this point, he realizes she's been talking about his situation. She's been basically play acting. And of course, he could have been angry. He could have taken it out on this woman. He could have taken it out on Joab, because he understands that Joab's the one who put the words into her mouth. He knew that Joab put her up to this. In fact, he says in first part of verse 19, is the hand of Joab with you in all this, which he probably already believed to begin with. And she, of course, told him that it was Joab's plan. So why did he not bring Absalom home? There was no doubt a mixture of emotions there. He was guilty. He should have been held responsible. On the other hand, David loved Absalom. He loved him to the very end, even beyond events that we will talk about in this lesson and lessons later on. So he realizes, as he hears his story, that Joab is the one encouraging him to do this. Joab is the one who put this woman up to coming to him, telling this story, and basically answering her question with an answer that applied to him. And so he understands that it's time to do something about this. And so after some consideration of the woman's story, he's ready to talk to Joab. The king said to Joab, all right, I have granted this thing. Go therefore, bring back the young man Absalom. Again, no doubt, with still mixed emotions. So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. So Absalom comes back home, in a sense. However, he's not going to see David right away. David tells Joab, do not bring him to me right away, but rather take him home. And that's where Absalom is going to stay for a period of time. So he's not in exile anymore. He's able to come back. an indication of some degree perhaps of forgiveness, but things still have not been made right with his father, the king. And so as we proceed, we see that in the next few verses, David does essentially forgive Absalom, even though he could never approve of what Absalom did. Absalom was back home. He goes to his home at David's command, and for 2 years, nothing happens. He doesn't see the king. He doesn't get to see his father. He wonders perhaps what is going to happen. He wonders why David doesn't do something, contact him, why Joab doesn't get involved, because Joab's the one who instigated this situation in the first place. So during that time, Absalom is wanting Joab to intervene again and get him to see what needs to be done here. So while this is going on, the delay, in all Israel, we read, there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. So we see that Absalom was the kind of young man that people would look at and say, he'd probably make a good leader. Now, that's not true, but sometimes that's what people say. They judge by appearance. And of course, we learned back even when David was chosen, God doesn't choose by appearance. But Absalom was someone everybody looked at and said, handsome young man. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And from what happened later on, we might assume that Absalom probably thought those looks entitled him to some things. But that's going to be yet in the future. And Absalom dwelt 2 years full years in Jerusalem, but did not see the king's face. The text here goes on and tells us that Absalom grew his hair very, very long. In fact, he only cut it once a year because it got so heavy he apparently had to. And when he did, it was weighed, and it weighed, according to the king's official measurements, 200 shekels, which, as far as we can tell, was somewhere around 3 pounds of hair. And that was cut off once a year. We learned that he had 3 sons and 1 daughter during this time. The son, or the daughter rather, he named Tamar, no doubt in thinking about the sister that he cared so much about, the one who was molested by Amnon and the one who had caused him to flee in the first place. So he names his daughter after her, Tamar. But he's still waiting to be reunited with the king. And he sends word to Joab twice. And he asked Joab, why haven't you done anything? And so as we continue, we read this. Finally, Absalom loses patience. He decides it's time to take action to get Joab's attention, and he certainly does so. So he said to his servant, see, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. And Absalom's servant set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and came to Absalom's house and said to him, why have your servant set my field on fire? So we see that Absalom most certainly did get Joab's attention by doing something that was not really productive, not a friendly reminder, but something very extreme for Joab's attention, and he does get Joab's attention. Joab comes to him and he makes his case. He says, why did you bring me back here if I'm not going to see my father? I'm not going to be able to see the king and see about reconciliation. I might as well have stayed in Geshur where I was. If I'm just going to sit in my house here and not be able to be who I want to be. So Joab arranged a meeting, and Absalom went and he fell before King David's face. He behaved very repentant. David raised him up and gave him a kiss, and a meaning apparently meaning that he was at least to some extent forgiven. Here's the text. So Joab went to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. Then the king kissed Absalom. So even after this tragedy that cost David one of his sons, a tragedy within the family, he still loved Absalom. He gave him this kiss of approval, and he forgave him. Now, we would have perhaps a little bit of a happier ending if the story stopped here. But as a student of the Old Testament, you probably know that the situation is going to get worse instead of better because of Absalom's attitude and the actions that are about to follow. Because as we move into chapter 15, we see Absalom's treason. Absalom is literally going to try to overthrow his father, King David, the assumption being he would probably kill him and take over the throne. That seemed to be his plan. So before we go into the details of that, here's a map that will kind of help us to understand. In the text we'll read in just a moment, we see that Absalom, on a pretense, went down to a place called Hebron to offer sacrifices. He told his dad that he'd made a vow that if he ever got back to Jerusalem, he was going to go to Hebron and offer certain sacrifices, and now it was time for him to do that. So David allowed him to go, and apparently did not suspect anything as far as we know. The red lines in the map then show that David had to eventually flee when Absalom began the revolt, to cross the Jordan River and to go up into an area known as the Forest of Ephraim, which we believe, as far as we can tell, was somewhere around the area indicated upon this map. So that's what's going to happen in the next chapter or two, and in fact beyond that, as we'll look at in our next lesson next week. So after this, it happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. Now again, if you were David, you would think, why would this not be suspicious? It's obvious that Absalom is trying to present himself as someone very special, someone who's ready to move on the throne, ready to be king, someone that he wants the people to approve. He's acting like a king with chariots and horses and 50 men running before him. This is the sort of thing that royalty did, and yet he was not king yet. And in fact, he wasn't to be king according to God's will. And that wasn't where it stopped. Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate where people would come and go from the city of Jerusalem. So it was whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, that Absalom came to the king, that Absalom would call him and say, "What city are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel." Well, that would be the beginning of a conversation. And Absalom, rather than being thankful that he was allowed to come back to Jerusalem, that he was able to receive forgiveness from King David, his attitude and his actions were very, very cruel, very, very cunning, very sad for what he had received by way of forgiveness, especially. He was acting the politician in the worst sort of ways. He was standing at the gate, and whenever somebody came, he would hear what their problem was. And he would say, "Oh, if the king just had a judge to take care of that, because you are absolutely right in your cause. If I were in charge, I would see that you got what was coming to you, that you would be treated right, that you would win your case." And it would seem that he said the same thing to everybody. He was everybody's friend. He gave them the answer that they wanted to hear. And beyond that, it said whenever somebody was so impressed with him in these meetings that they would bow down and he would hold his hand out so that they might kiss his hand. And so Absalom was doing the things that royalty did. He was acting like a king. And of course, we know that that was on his heart, to become king, not waiting until after his father died, but paving the way through these false meetings and conversations with people as they came to Jerusalem, and paving the way for the kingship and perhaps for the rebellion that's going to happen in just a little while. Well, as we read on, we find that the time came when Absalom decided that it was time to make his move. Some have suggested that Absalom perhaps thought that because David was older, he'd been on the throne for a while, that his actions might be seen simply as a move towards succession, not as a rebellion or as treason, but he's older. He's going to give up the throne. It'll be time to start taking over. And, I'm just doing what comes natural, what's going to happen anyway. Perhaps that was on Absalom's mind. Perhaps it was not. We aren't given that much insight into his mind. But anyway, we know what he did. In this manner, Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. That is, he told them they were right, he would support them, and he let them kiss his hand as if he were royalty. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. He was laying the groundwork for a rebellion that was right around the corner. Now it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow which I made to the Lord." Now, the word 40 there, as in 40 years, can be explained in one of two ways. It's a possibility that what we have here is a scribal error, because other translations have the word 4 years, which is more likely. Others have said this is probably the right copy, the right writing for this, because perhaps Absalom was about 40 years old. At any rate, he wasn't waiting 40 years for this to happen. He was probably waiting about 4 years. And he comes to his father, as we've already discussed, and he said, "I have this vow, and I've got to go to Hebron to keep it." And David apparently, at least as far as we're told, did not suspect anything was wrong. And he allows him to go and to pay the vow. It sounded like a good story. It sounded like something that any king, any father would support. You made a vow to God, you've got to keep that vow. So David gave his blessing to that and allowed him to go. And of course, that was not at all what Absalom had in mind. But I want you to notice the answer that David gave to him. And the king said to him, "Go in peace." Did you ever think about the fact that the very last thing that David said to his living son, Absalom, was "Go in peace"? That was David's attitude toward his son, was a peaceful life. It was so far from the things that actually were about to happen. And the treachery that Absalom was about to begin and to play out eventually in his death, his father having to leave for a while on the run like he was when King Saul was chasing him, and then eventually come back to Jerusalem. But his final words when Absalom was still alive was to say to him, "Go in peace." And of course, that was not what happened at all. Then he arose, that is Absalom, and went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, 'Absalom reigns in Hebron.'" Well, in another part of the text here, and we're not going to read it all, it tells us that Absalom took along 200 men with him. 200 men, in fact, who had no idea what was about to happen. They were caught in a difficult situation. And they went with him to accompany him. He was the king's son. He should have been protected. He should have been accompanied there on this journey, protected from any dangers. But these 200 men were not part of the rebellion, at least not knowingly as they left Jerusalem. They went to him. And then as he sends out his spies, and this message begins to filter through the country of Israel and all the people, his strength just grows and grows. More and more people come to him until there's an extent in which David fears him. He has such an army that David fears him coming. He fears there'll be a battle in Jerusalem. It would be a terrible battle. And so he decides to escape from Jerusalem and just leave things there for Absalom and see what happens after that. So, chapter 15, David escapes from Jerusalem because he knows what Absalom is now up to. Now a messenger came to David, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. Now, this is not 100% true, as we'll learn later. Perhaps this was an exaggeration. David still had plenty of supporters, but so did Absalom, to the point where could have been a great loss of life. A lot of bad things could happen, and it could have happened right there in Jerusalem if David had stayed there and waited for Absalom to come, and a battle then involving everybody. So David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. It's certainly possible that he had no idea how many soldiers Absalom would have with him. David said to his people, make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. So David leaves, and he leaves with a good number of allies. And it's interesting that his allies were, number one, many of them apparently not Jews, but in the sense of where they were from, where they were born, foreigners. It's also interesting that many of these people who were continuing to be loyal to him, who were his supporters during this time of Absalom's rebellion, were some of the same ones who were with him when Saul was seeking his life. In other words, they were loyal to David, we might say, through thick and thin. But David does not want to have bad things happen here at Jerusalem, not knowing exactly what sort of army he stood up against. And he doesn't want to be caught along the way in the journey. And so he wants to go to where he's going to be staying and get there quickly and be prepared to meet whatever threat comes his way then, and not while they're just trying to get out of Jerusalem and make their way to a place of safety. So as he is leaving, a number of interesting things happen to David and those who were with him. First of all, as he was leaving, and this was before he got very far out of Jerusalem, and all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. This is the way that we know that there were many people who were not on the side of Absalom. There were many people who were favoring David, and perhaps many people who were not prepared to put up a fight, who were not soldiers, who were not able to do anything to help him. But this was a sad thing, because the king that God had put in place, the king that God had ordained, was having to leave the city to run for his life, we might say. The king himself also crossed over the brook Kidron, and all the people crossed over toward the way of the wilderness. So David has supporters, but it's still necessary to leave and to make his way to a place where he and his supporters can perhaps put up a battle if that's going to be necessary. Now, as he leaves, there are a number of people with him that have conversations with him, that have different questions that come up. One of them was the high priest by the name of Zadok. He was ready to go. In fact, he brought the Ark of the Covenant along. He said, we're going to go, and we're going to take things with us. You're the rightful king, and this is the way it should be. The king said to Zadok, carry the Ark of God back into the city. David did not want the Ark of God being with him on the run from his son Absalom. David said, if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place. In other words, David said, if the Lord wills, I'll be back. I'll be back in the presence of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. You know, it won't be taken away from me if that's the Lord's will. Yeah, I'll see it again, and there's no need to take it. And encouraged Zadok to stay with it. David said, but if he says thus, I have no delight in you, here I am, let him do to me as it seems good to him. David was perhaps thinking about the mistakes that he'd made, because by this time he'd made a number of mistakes. And he thought perhaps maybe the Lord was ready for him to be not king anymore. And he was ready to accept the Lord's will. If the Lord wanted him to come back to Jerusalem, continue serving as king, that's what would be. If the Lord did not, then that's what would be also. So David sends him back along with the ark. There's another person who wants to go with David. His name is Hushai. Now, Hushai is someone who was something of an advisor, and he's just insisting on going with David, even though he's not able to travel very quickly. And David says to him, no, you would just be a burden to me, but here's how you can help me. You can go back to Jerusalem and you can pretend to be a supporter of my son Absalom, and you can be my spy, and also you can be the one who provides Absalom with the kind of information that will not help him, but rather help him to be defeated in his purpose. And so Hushai agrees to do that. And so David begins traveling with those people with him as he leaves the area of Jerusalem and goes to a place of safety. Again, here's that map. He has to cross the Jordan River. He has to cross the river Jabbok, making his way to the forest of Ephraim. And that's going to happen in future chapters that we'll look at. Now, also on the way out, he meets a fellow by the name of Ziba. Ziba is a servant of Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who was injured, whose foot was hurt, who sat under David's table and was cared for all the days of his life because David wanted to do something kind for Jonathan. He made a pact with Jonathan. They were close, closer than brothers. And so he had taken good care of Mephibosheth. And Ziba was basically Mephibosheth's top servant, his number one right-hand man, taking care of the property that he had inherited from Saul and his father Jonathan. So Ziba comes and tells David that Mephibosheth has turned on him. As soon as he heard that Absalom was coming, Ziba says, Mephibosheth said, okay, now things are going to be made right. And everything's going to be okay. He was in favor of Absalom coming back and taking over, which was not the case at all. In other words, Ziba lied. So on the spur of that moment, and without thinking well, as he should have, David said to Ziba, okay, if that's the way he's acting, then you get all of his property. You get the land, you get his property. It's all yours. You can take that over. So Ziba seeks to profit by a lie, but that lie is going to catch up with him in another chapter that we'll look at in just a little while. So Ziba he meets and seems to be an ally, but not very trustworthy. He also meets a man by the name of Shimei. Now Shimei is somehow distantly related to King Saul. He's of that house of Saul, and he holds a grudge. He hates David, in fact. And even though Shimei seems to be pretty much on his own, at least not with an army or a group of soldiers, and David is there with all of the people who are protecting him, and many of them trained warriors making their way to escape, Shimei takes the occasion to take his anger out on David, not thinking about the fact that David could have easily killed him. And so he runs along the way and he curses David, and he says, you're getting what you deserve for what you've done before. And of course, David had done nothing before other than take over once Saul was dead, because he refused to kill Saul. He was innocent in all of that, but Shimei blames him. And he throws rocks at David. He walks along as they make it down the journey. He throws rocks at him. And one of David's right-hand men who are with him, Abishai, he says, just let me go kill him. I'll take care of him. You don't have to put up with this. This is not right. It's like a dog trying to attack you. This is wrong. And David will not allow this. In fact, to indicate the heart of David here, the forgiving type of heart that he had, and the kind of heart that trusted God even in this difficult situation, being run out of town. Here's what David said. First of all, he would not let Abishai kill Shimei, even though he easily could have. And David said, it may be that the Lord will look upon my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. In other words, David said, I'm going to do the right thing. And it may be the Lord's going to take care of me, and I look back on this, and the Lord's going to bless me because I didn't take vengeance. I allowed someone to curse me. And sometimes, of course, that's what God's people just have to do. In order to be the right kind of example, they have to have the heart of David and say, I know God knows this. Perhaps it'll mean something to God, and I'll receive a blessing from it. But at any rate, I'm going to put up with cursing. I'm not going to respond in a way that I should not respond. So David sets a very good example for us here in allowing Shimei to live, even though he could have easily had his life taken. Once we come near the end of chapter 16, we find that another person who is involved is Ahithophel. And Ahithophel is one of the trusted people who basically takes the side of Absalom, totally on Absalom's side. As Absalom gets to Jerusalem, of course, David and his immediate supporters are gone. So there's no battle to be taken. And one of the things that Absalom does is ask Ahithophel for advice. Ahithophel is supposed to be sort of an advisor or a counselor. And in fact, this is the fellow that David sent Hushai back in order to counteract him. When Ahithophel would give one kind of advice, Hushai had the opportunity to give some other advice that would result in things not being productive for Absalom. And that will come in another chapter in our next study. So the advice of Ahithophel to Absalom was this. He said, if you want to be king, you want to show everybody you're king, you take those 10 concubines that David left behind and you go in unto them, just like the king would. Now, this is a practice that we have to wonder about, that God allowed, but David allowed these concubines to be available to David, and now they're going to be available to Absalom. And they were a part of being king, at least in this particular case in time. And they belonged only to the king. But Ahithophel says, don't just go into them. Let's put up a tent on top of the house here where everybody can see it. And let it be known that's where the concubines are staying. And you go into them in the presence of everybody. Everybody can see that you're doing that. Everyone can see that you are taking advantage of the things that go along with kingship. And so that's exactly what Absalom does. Now, as we think back, we remember that one of the things that Nathan had foretold because of David's sin with Bathsheba and resulting in the death of Uriah the Hittite, one of the things he said was that which you have is going to be taken away from you, even referring to these concubines here. That which was his would be taken by others, and that's going to come into play here. And so Absalom, at least by appearance, takes a firm hold on the throne, and he says to everybody, this is it. I'm king now. I'm going to act like the king. I'm going to be your king, even though this was for a short time. Now, Hushai comes back, and of course, Absalom knows that Hushai has been pretty close to his dad, an advisor to the king. And he wonders if he can trust him. And so he asks Hushai, he said, you're my father's friend. You know, what are you doing here? Where do you stand? And Hushai says like this, which is deceitful, but not exactly a falsehood. He says, my job is to be, and I'm paraphrasing this, he says, my job is to be with the one who God approves as king. My job is to be with the one who's actually doing the reigning, who's in charge, and whoever that is, that's where I need to be. And of course, that was true. And what he was doing was exactly that. But in saying it the way that he did, he deceived Absalom into thinking that he would be a worthy advisor or counselor. That's exactly what happened. And what David wanted to happen through Hushai being there was what happened. So Absalom said to Hushai, is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend? Referring to King David. And Hushai said to Absalom, no, but whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel choose, his I will be, and I will remain. So that is Hushai's deceiving statement of truth right there. And as we go into the next few chapters, we're going to see that Hushai had the opportunity to mislead, to miscommunicate with Absalom and cost him possibly some more success in his attempt to kill his father or overthrow his father and take over the throne completely. Hushai was still a good friend to King David. Well, that's our study for chapters 14 through 16. We're drawing to a close of 2 Samuel. We're going to see the conclusion of the story, both in Absalom's efforts to overthrow David, and then shortly after that, the remainder of King David's kingship over Israel. Sometimes that he made good decisions, and still, again, sometimes that he made bad decisions. We'll be looking at those over the next two lessons, which will be concluding our study of 2 Samuel. Hope you'll be with us for both of those. Again, this is our contact information. If you need to contact us for whatever reasons, this is how you get in touch with us, and we would certainly be glad to communicate with you by phone call, text, email, whatever would be best for you. Thank you for being with us for this study.